Spoiler, this is not a higher ed session. Correct, Chairman Turner? We know, go back 2013, it was a water session. Go back 2015, it was a transportation session. Whatever else this session may be, and it probably is a public ed session and a property tax session, it's not really a higher ed session, right?
Well, first off, good morning. Thank you.
Good morning.
Thank you for doing this.
We don't do good mornings. Dive right in. Yeah.
You know, I think every session should be a higher education session. Higher education is critical to the future of our state. It's critical to our quality of life, to our economy, and it's important for all the reasons that everyone in this room no doubt knows. Now, is higher education going to be the highest profile issue this session? Yeah, probably not.
Or even top 3, top 5. I mean, there's a lot of business before all of you in this legislature. Mm-hmm. I'm just not hearing a lot of talk up the street about higher ed.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what I hope we focus on, and certainly in working with my colleagues in the House, and Chairman Creighton and I have had very good conversations about some of the things we can hopefully do together. You know, let's figure out how to make college more accessible. Let's see how we improve efficiencies to where we're making improvements in transferability.
Right.
And how do we support our community colleges, which is so vital. They have, of all the students, college students in Texas, over
more than 50% are at community colleges.
Two-year colleges, right? So how do we support them so that we meet the goals of our 60 by 30 Texas plan?
So there are discrete items, Chairman Creighton. It's just not that there's a fire to be put out necessarily, as there may be, some would say, on public ed.
That's right. I mean, I agree with Chris. It's and I know you would feel the same, that we're always in a higher education session, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there are different conversations that sort of rise to the top with our priorities. It's the nature of the system that we're in, where we're here just a few months every couple of years, and so emergency items alone will dictate the conversation and how the flow of information is covered from media to the halls of the Capitol and the different circles for priorities. But if there's a subject that aligns so many of us in the building, it is higher education and making sure, as Chris said, that we set every student up for success and opportunity that's possible, and it's directly tied to our workforce and the economy and the economic engine that we are all so proud of as Texans in both parties. We talk about that so much. And there's not a way to disassociate that from what we will be working on and the policies that affect higher ed.
And you feel like the House and Senate, whatever other fights might emerge in the press, is always rooting for the House and the Senate to be coming at one another like spider monkeys, right? We love that when that happens. Whatever other issues happen between the House and the Senate, you all are reasonably aligned.
It's a very visual description, but very accurate.
Yeah.
But I mean, come on, do I lie? I mean, that's exactly what happened.
Mm-hmm. When Chris and I both served as caucus chair in the House together, we had some of those days and nights. So yes, you're
but not now. This is not your first time at this, right? Now, Chairman Creighton, Chairman Turner had been on this committee before. You go from 0 to 60 this session. You were not even on this committee previously.
That's right, and I wasn't on the property tax committee either. I mean,
well, it didn't exist.
Not as a standing committee, but in the interim, we had a traveling committee that worked on that, and I was able to serve in that respect. But we all have new roles and new assignments. One thing that's constant is change around here, and sometimes it's a good thing. But I'm also relying on a lot of perspective from those that have served in these positions before. I've spent quite a bit of time with Chairman Seliger.
Right.
And I've had some really good conversations with my former colleague, Dan Branch, and, in talking to Chairman Branch about some of the things he has done in the past and serving in this position, it led me to go over to the Higher Education Coordinating Board and spend a few hours with employees there, met a lot of great people, and sat in a cubicle with someone that's worked in the financial aid part of the building for over 20 years.
So you're studying for the test.
And that's right. And just making myself available to open these conversations and be ready for policy that we'll all consider and discuss and have as priorities. But top to bottom, it's important to me to know exactly what a broad range of priorities are.
Right.
And to consider the same.
Chair Turner, do you buy the argument that it actually is a higher ed session in the sense that if it's a public ed session, it's a higher ed session, that public ed is the inputs to higher ed? If you fix public ed, you're actually indirectly fixing higher ed, because if you're able to graduate kids who are more college ready, if you produce kids who are better able to learn and who are thinking more about the opportunity to be leveraged in the future, that's really one seamless piece.
You know, I think that's well stated, and yes, I absolutely agree with that. I think, while we talk about higher education obviously being of paramount importance, I think we all agree, I think there's bipartisan agreement, is past time to do something about our public school finance system. And so I'm thrilled that there's bipartisan and bicameral movement on that. But absolutely, college readiness coming out of high school is a key area where we're not doing well enough in Texas. I mean, that's simply a fact. And we have a lot of people from different institutions around the state here today, and that's something we hear from them a lot is,
right.
A lot of students are coming out of high school having to go into, say a remedial type program
right.
once they hit college to get up to speed. And we got to do better in that regard. And that affects graduation rates,
right.
that affects graduation time, that affects the student debt or the amount of money they're having to spend.
Right.
So it affects a lot of things. And so I think that, as we talk about how do we improve outcomes coming out of high school,
right.
Obviously we need to put more resources into the classrooms in order to help achieve that, put resources where they're needed.
And then that's going to reverberate as you move the conversation. I mean, Chair Creighton, you both recall the conversation around HB 5, just as one example, where there was a discussion of changing the graduation requirements in high school, and some in higher ed felt that all public ed was going to do in that case was dump a problem on its doorstep, right? You're going to send these kids out of high school who are less prepared to enter college, and there's going to be a need for remediation, and that really, although it was public ed legislation, it was effectively higher ed legislation.
Sure. I mean, there's always a debate on rigor, right?
Right.
I mean, in HB 5, we worked on the STEM pathways, and we worked on, a lot of the expertise and the input from public education experts and faculty all around the state, administration. They wanted to reduce the reliance on the test, so we reduced the standardized test down
right.
from 15 to 5. But the discussion of rigor, I remember on the House floor at that time, and I know Representative Strama was very involved in that subject as an author.
I think he was one of two people to vigorously oppose this change, because he worried that for the reasons I said, it would create
right.
this problem at the doorstep of higher ed.
And we see the percentages of especially in math, where we have to remediate.
Right.
A lot of our students need
right.
additional help to be able to make that jump from the high school level into the university level. And some students are surprised that what they experience is Algebra 1 and 2 at the high school level, and then they enter Algebra 1 at the university level, and to them it's really trigonometry.
Yep.
It's a high level of rigor. So are they prepared? What can we do to be right. Better about giving them a platform to launch that of greater success? I think we're going to be having a lot of those conversations this session.
Right, so we'll stipulate the public ed piece and the higher ed piece are related, but let's spend our productive time today on the higher ed piece and the big topics that we know, again, whether it's a higher ed session or not, are likely to come up. Mm-hmm. Chairman Turner, let me ask you straight away, does the state spend enough money on higher education? No. Chairman Creighton?
I think we can improve. We're at a $20 billion level, for higher education funding, and it's the initiatives within and how we determine all of those priorities as whether or not we should hold the line or increase. So for Texas grants, for instance, or for the Texas Research Fund initiative, for the Tier 1 investment, I think in the current budgets on the Senate side, we're holding the line to slightly advancing.
The House and the Senate introduced budgets are both, whatever else the House and Senate does not agree on, it's a 1.6% increase mm-hmm. in each of the House and Senate introduced budgets, wherever it ends up.
Had some slight increases, but
right.
I think, it's obviously all of our opinions that it's dependent upon the resources we have.
And how do they spend that money?
How we fight for those priorities. But right. when we have an unprecedented, property tax overhaul, maybe the third in 84 years of, probably the most significant in at least 40-something years. For school finance, it's definitely one of just a handful in over 80 years. And then We've got to fill a gap on Medicaid at about $1 billion.
Well, you know so well on your own legislation, Hurricane Harvey.
And to mention Harvey,
right,
where
yeah.
I stood with other senators yesterday on the Senate comprehensive plan to commit to help with a local match and also a flood mitigation initiative going forward. And we didn't, you know, there's so many things within the budget and going through the interim that we don't expect. Certainly Harvey was one of them.
Right. So Chairman, you think that if regardless of whether higher ed needs more money or deserves more money, there may be a question of whether there is more money to be given to higher ed in a session like this one?
Well, exactly, and these numbers are fluid, right? In so many of these big categories, there's sweeping changes that evolve back and forth, sometimes daily. And so how do you backfill to the extent to where our higher ed commitment and initiatives and all of our priorities are met? But I think we'll get there.
Yeah.
Chair.
Well, yeah, I agree with much of that. I think that you know where the House-based budget bill starts out and the Senate-based bill in terms of higher education, you know, we've heard very good feedback, I think, from a lot of institutions on it. Certainly, I think it's a better experience so far for them than it was at this time 2 years ago.
I think last time they thought they were getting a big haircut and they had to buy back that to the end. I mean, this is like flat is the new up.
Absolutely,
right?
and well, that's true. That's true.
Right.
And so I really commend the appropriators in both chambers for making sure that we're not back in that situation we were 2 years ago, and the budget's still being written in the Appropriations Committee, the Senate Finance Committee. So we'll see where that ends up. Hopefully, it'll be a good investment in higher education. When I say no, I don't think the state spends enough money, I'm talking about over the last 20 years or so. You've seen the state share of funding for higher education just continue to drop.
Similar to what we hear on the public ed side. The state's
Absolutely.
gotten out of the business of funding this and it's been passed on to the end users.
No, that's right. And particularly, I'll mention community colleges again. They've taken a particularly big decline over the years, but certainly our four-year institutions have as well, and our healthcare institutions have.
I interviewed a president at Chancellor, Renu Couture of the University of Houston system 2 days ago, and she trotted out a statistic I had not heard. She said that the formula funding per credit hour since 2010 is down 23%. So she identifies just in a very short window of time the degree to which the state's share, Chair Creighton, of funding has dropped. And again, on the public ed side, it's the reason we're having a property tax conversation adjacent to the public ed conversation is those are the end users, property taxpayers, who have picked up the share that the state is no longer paying. It's not exactly that sequence, but you understand what I'm saying. There's a rebalancing that has to happen. Well, in the higher ed version of this, it is students and families who've picked up the part that the state has stopped funding. So what do you say about that?
I think that's exactly what we find ourselves in now, which is the budget process, right? I mean, we see the trends. We're going to have a lot of sort of thoughtful or robust conversations.
I guess, Chairman, are you sympathetic to the problem that students and families feel right now, where they say, look, the state is not doing enough, and therefore we're having to do more, and we're having a conversation about affordability of higher ed?
I fought and scraped and worked my way through my own higher education experience in such a degree that I align with that same sentiment, the same emotion, and the same fears that it may not be possible. I remember that.
Right.
I mean, when I was 17, my family lost everything financially. And when I entered my own higher education experience, I got a job as a pipe fitter at a chemical plant, and I relied on community college experience and ended up at the University of Texas. And the couple of years I worked as a pipe fitter at a chemical plant, it was the hottest job you could imagine. So I found the air-conditioned building up the road here.
Yep.
And got a job there 29 years ago to work on staff. It wasn't to do this one day. It was just to survive.
But of course, when you went to school and you had your own personal challenges, and it's good to hear you tell that because it's good to be sympathetic having had that experience. UT cost a lot less than it does now.
Yeah,
right.
Affordability is something that we have to continue to work on and to make advances in giving those a fighting chance that haven't had that in the past.
So let me ask you if you have a theory in your short tenure as chair, but you've been a legislator longer than you've been chair. Do you have a theory of the case on tuition rates whether public university tuition rates, and for that matter, community college tuition rates, are too high, too low, or just right?
Well, I think from an affordability standpoint, they could always be lower, right? I mean, when we're talking about the gap on the ability for students that are first-generation college students, or whether we're talking about veterans, or whether we're talking about a single mom that is, leaving work every day to go to night school, whatever the case, we need to do the best we can to make sure there's an affordable route and where those goals are achievable. And again, I was in one of those need categories.
Right.
So, the budget process is, as you mentioned, it's all about priorities, and we're in a session where we have some additional revenue that we did not have the last biennium, and we talk a lot about the state's share of public education going down on a trend, but look what we've been through. I mean, we've been through the Great Recession and subprime crash. Right after I came into the legislature, I came in 2007. That was in the fall of 2008.
2008, right.
We had to cut $16 billion from the budget, and we spent several years backfilling that. We talk about the state's share of education being 50-50 in 2010, but that's not a coincidence that decline started again right after that Great Recession.
Right.
So we spent all that time backfilling the budget, all those years to get back to where we were at equilibrium. And then oil went down. And if you look at a 30-year trend on oil, it normally bounces in a year and a half. It didn't this time. And we're so dependent upon that for our revenue, even though our economy is extremely diverse, and we've done a great job at that over time.
Yep.
This has been a 10-year downturn in our predictability, but our commitment has to be there, right? Because we can't leave others behind.
Yeah.
And that's where we are. But it's a novel idea. We balance our budget. We don't have a treasury to throw another trillion at it. So we talk about winners and losers a lot in the state share, but we're climbing back where we need to be.
Chairman, I mean, I stipulated that we don't have a treasury to dip into. We have to balance a budget, but how we balance it, some would say, is on the backs of students and families. So, Chair Turner, the affordability conversation is one that everybody understands, everybody can be sympathetic to, but at the same time, you will have chancellors and their associates march up the street and say, we need to raise, we're going to raise, here's why we're raising. It's because we can't keep pace with the precipitous population growth and the need to invest in the future of this state. So where do you find that balance, Chairman Turner?
Well, and that's where I come back to. I say I think our goal should be for the state to begin to, over time, increase its share of the cost of higher education.
Go back up.
Because that will keep the pressure on tuition rates down. And think about, and I agree, we've had a tumultuous revenue situation over the last decade, really, since the Great Recession. But if you look at the decline in higher education funding from the state, really, you can trace it back to the 1980s, and it's steadily dropped, but it really started dropping post-2003. And that was another economic downturn at that time in that session, before either one of us, you weren't here then, were you? Yeah. So before either one of us were here, but
deregulation of tuition.
So that's when tuition deregulation happened, and it sort of was, okay, we're not going to fund higher education at the level we've been historically funding at. So universities, you go out, and well, not universities, but boards of regents, you go out systems and decide what those tuition rates should be, and that's how you get your revenue. And we're going to pitch in what we can, but it's going to be less than it has been before. And so we've seen tuition increase. But let me also say that our tuition rates in Texas, whether we're talking about a four-year institution or a two-year institution or even a graduate institution, is still a very good deal. When you compare our costs to national figures, it is a very good deal. When you look at student debt nationally, you see some really scary numbers. Our numbers in Texas
are actually better.
Are much better.
Right. Do you worry, Chairman Turner, Chairman Creighton, that other business you're doing in the legislature has an inadvertent consequence on this conversation? We reported it about 2 weeks ago that one of the byproducts, weirdly, maybe not weirdly, of the property tax conversation is that if the rollback rates go down to 2.5% or come down to some degree, one of the indirect consequences of that is that community college districts, particularly, again, more than 50% of the enrollment is in community colleges, that community college districts will be restrained in their ability to raise the revenue they need, and they're floating the possibility of needing to raise community college tuitions on a population of students, let's be honest, who are probably least able to afford the increases, Chairman Turner. So what do you do about that?
I'm deeply concerned about that,
Yeah.
and it's a top priority for me. It's obviously not in the Higher Education Committee, it's in the Ways and Means Committee in the House, but is to work with my colleagues to get community colleges out of that bill because of all the reasons you just
So you're going to
mentioned.
try to get the community colleges exempted.
And I think there's a lot of interest in not having
Chair Creighton, do you want to exempt the community colleges?
I won't be pushing any exemptions. I think that we have to decide exactly how that policy needs to look at the end of the day, which what we worked on last session. We worked on negotiations that eventually fell short,
Right.
you know, but I think that that a limit on government spending is also, you know, there's metrics in the bill to allow for need to be addressed. At the same time, there's a limit as a rollback rate, which all we're doing is readjusting that from where it was set 40 years ago, based on
when inflation was significantly higher.
double-digit inflation,
right?
And in the legislative intent on the floor for that bill passing, it was mentioned by the author that we need to readdress it as soon as inflation.
Right. So your
goes
theory
back
is that
down.
the community college districts need more revenue. They're not being told they can't go get it. They simply have to explain themselves, go to the voters, and then the voters will say grace over it.
That's the metric in the bill that I mentioned, but I also know that the legislative process, we have to commit ourselves to community college success, and
right.
I certainly relied on community colleges and at every step of the way, and I'm fully committed to that. And I think every level of government that's affected by our property tax reform, that you know, we're going to be in the same budgeting process every 2 years. That's right.
No exceptions.
That's right.
Chairman Turner, the conversation on higher ed funding has often pivoted to efficiency. Again, mirroring public ed. You know, the public ed conversation is, well, yeah, we think we should put more money into public ed, but we want to be sure that the money we're spending in public ed now is being spent efficiently. You know, again, without picking on any one, superintendent salaries are too high. There's too much money not going into the classroom, non-instructional spending. That school district in the valley that has a water park, you know, you get these outsized examples that ultimately overwhelm the whole conversation about efficiency. There's a version of that, Chairman Turner, as you know, in public ed, and here is where I'd ask my friends from the UT system to go to the bathroom for the next minute. You know, we have the LTIF report, which came out, 6 or 8 months ago, talking about spending at the UT system. And I don't want to pick on the UT system alone. It's more generally about system spending generally. You know, are we spending too much money in higher ed currently that does not go into the classroom, that does not educate any students, that does not confer a degree? That is way too simplistic a way to talk about this issue. But the broad principle of efficiency in higher ed funding is necessarily, Chairman Turner, going to be part of the conversation.
Absolutely,
right?
And it should be.
Yeah.
It should be. Look, you know, there's no question we can find added efficiencies in higher education.
Yeah.
And I think the topic you bring up with respect to, you know, systems spending, overhead, administrative costs, whatever you want to call it, needs to be part of that conversation. I think that, and I want to help facilitate that. I think one of the biggest efficiencies we can make headway on, though, is in the issue of transferability, and where we are seeing on average, and get these numbers right, the average bachelor degree recipient in the state of Texas is graduating with an extra 18 hours beyond what they needed with their degree, and so that translates then into tens of millions of dollars per year that students or someone is spending that on hours that are unnecessary.
You're talking about
to achieve that credential.
the question of, if you go to community college and you a certain number of credit hours or credits, whether universities are taking those credits and allowing students to graduate effectively on time.
And it can also be between two four-year institutions.
Correct.
When someone transfers.
Right.
Or it can be that credit counts at this school, but
in fact,
not
probably
in
some
this.
high school stuff as well would probably.
It does, but they may take the credit, but they may say not in this major, not in the major you're going into.
Right.
So those are all things we have to look at,
Right.
And I think everyone's going to have to give a little bit. But if we do that, I think we can improve efficiencies, get students graduated faster at a lower overall cost,
Right.
and free up more space in the system to keep moving people through.
Chair Creighton, that was in fact, I believe, agenda item number 1 in the interim charges of the Senate Higher Education Committee between the last session and this, was the question of transferability and the degree to which we can solve some of the problems that we're talking about by making certain that transferability is more seamless, is smoother, right?
That's right. We had our first Senate Higher Education Committee hearing yesterday, as you mentioned when we were talking about things before we started. And Senator West has been, leading on that issue. He brought the bill through the Senate last session, and he's reintroduced it again. We'll consider it.
How you feel about it?
Pretty soon. I think it's very important. I mean, we have a lot of expertise in this room in the higher education world, and we've had many meetings that have related to this subject as well as so many others. But on on the transparency of the transferability for the student, to make sure there's not lost time and effort and curriculum that won't eventually help in the path that they take forward. We have to increase that transparency for them. We have to make sure there's alignment in ways that work for all institutions. But the details are always where the subject matter becomes difficult. And so I think we're going to take more steps this session than we were able to last session. And it's extremely important. It's a top 5 issue that we will consider, along with doing everything we can to strengthen 60 by 30, and along with funding and the budgeting priorities and other things that we're working on.
To the broader question of efficiency, you're a fiscal conservative. That's your brand, right? It was your brand in the House. It's your brand in the Senate. Do you go to these higher ed institutions when they come up the street and say to them, tell us how you're spending the money that we're giving you now before we talk about increasing your funding going forward?
Of course. I think we always, as lawmakers and as appropriators and as those that have to explain back at home in the district exactly how money and priority is established here and what the end result is after the equal sign. We have to be able to explain it.
Is your sense, I guess, Chairman, that there is an inefficiency problem right now? I guess I'm asking not in theory so much as in reality. Do you think that there's an inefficiency problem in higher ed?
Put another way, we could always be more efficient. But I think our higher education leaders and expertise that will be giving us a lot of input feel the same. We could always work towards greater efficiencies. And I know that knowing Chairman Turner and also knowing how I handle my office, we're going to be listening.
Yeah.
And so we're very open to both.
Chair.
And just, on that, when I talk about, I don't think the state is funding enough on higher education. I also think that at whatever level it's being funded, these dollars are precious. They're scarce, in my opinion. We need to make sure they're being spent as efficiently and effectively as possible. And so if there is waste in the system, we need to identify it and get rid of it. But we also need to just make the system more efficient for students.
So let me ask that. Let me come at that another way. What are the metrics? How do you know whether those dollars are being spent efficiently? I mean, you mentioned Chairman Branch, Chairman Creighton. I remember hearing Chairman Branch, when he was chair of higher ed in the House, talk about outcomes-based funding, outcomes-based funding, outcomes-based funding. I mean, that is now a narrative through line in every education conversation, public education and higher education. But what are the appropriate metrics to know whether the outcomes are the right outcomes, if you're going to tie some discussion of funding to performance?
Again, I have the highest level of confidence in our community colleges and our universities, and I'm relying on them as they impose their own metrics to be very transparent in how they portray success.
So you don't think there's one standard set of metrics that we should accept across the board, one unified set of metrics, one unified set of outcomes that we should be looking to?
Well, where I was going with my answer was as we implemented outcomes-based funding just a few years ago on community colleges and had that 10% variable in there for performance-based initiatives and results and bonuses for at-risk and non-at-risk students. It was those very community colleges that pivoted, came right back to us just a couple of years later and said, can you remove that cap? Can you remove that ceiling? And so I think that's a great testament to them and how we set the framework up for some of these metrics, as you mentioned, outcomes-based funding. And that the success is showing. It's still only 3% of our higher education appropriations and total budget initiatives, but the trend is powerful. And we have the people in place and the expertise in place that they're not afraid of some of these changes.
So the general principle, Chairman, and I want to go to Chairman Turner, the general principle that we should be paying higher ed on the basis of outputs and not inputs, you're good with that?
I'm comfortable with that, as we've seen a great track record there, and
Right.
and this is a phase-in, right? I mean,
Yeah.
this isn't pushing those initiatives on to our higher education institutions at an uncomfortable rate or
Right.
pace, and the fact that we have done it the way we've done it, they've shown situations or examples like I just mentioned
Right.
where they came back to us and asked for greater flexibility there.
Chairman Turner, let me actually take what the chairman said and turn it around and question whether the metrics, if we're looking at outputs, are anything to write home about. I look at the 8th grade cohort numbers, the ones that the coordinating board publishes, and we publish actually on our side as well. And it's basically, if you track kids who enter the 8th grade in Texas public schools through high school and then 6 years out, it's 1 in 5 who achieve some kind of completion, 4-year, 2-year, or career and technical. It was 21% in the last set of numbers. To put the numbers more specifically before you, in 2006, the last set of numbers that we have, 338,000 students entered the 8th grade in Texas public schools. 80,000 of those did not graduate high school. Another 80,000 did not go on to some form of higher ed, and then another 100,000 did not finish higher ed 6 years out. So it's 21%. If you're African American or Hispanic, it's closer to 1 in 10 than 1 in 5. If you're poor, regardless of race, it's closer to 1 in 11. Texas likes to talk about its exceptionalism. There is nothing exceptional about that kind of higher ed performance. So if we're going to base funding on outcomes, don't we have an outcomes problem with a big flashing red light right now?
Yes, we do. When we're talking about those statistics, yes.
Yeah.
And so, to the question about metrics, I think there are a number of metrics we ought to be looking at, and we need to have accountability on. You mentioned a few of them right there: African American graduation rates, or completion rates, Hispanic completion rates,
right.
Socioeconomically disadvantaged students. Those are numbers we need to do much better on, and we have institutions that are doing a great job in graduating more and more students who are from perhaps a disadvantaged background, historically disadvantaged background. Right. So I think we absolutely need to look at that. We need to look at the total number of degrees awarded, whether we're talking about associate's degrees, bachelor's degrees, or an advanced degree.
And you accept the fact that whether we get to the completion situation through the 2-year door or the 4-year door or the career and tech door, it's all good.
Absolutely.
Right? We're not marching only in one direction.
No, absolutely not. I mean, the 60 by 30 Texas plan says that by the year 2030, we need to have 60% of our young Texans between the ages of 22 and 35
right.
Yeah, have some sort of post-secondary, post-high school certification or degree. And that could be a bachelor's degree, it could be an associate's degree, or it could be just a career certification to go into a field, nursing or computer science or whatever. That's because that's what the economy will demand. And right now we're at about 42%. But that's another key metric we need to be looking at is right. How we're moving that number up.
Is that 60 by 30 goal, Chairman Creighton, ambitious enough for a state that likes to be first and best at everything?
Yeah, and I think it ties into your previous comment. I mean, we have a lot of work to do with the data you mentioned on the 8th grade performance in those particular categories, but it doesn't sound exceptional, but what is exceptional about Texas is that we evolve and we pivot when we have to address problems and challenges that we always face. We always have challenges that we have to face going forward. In the 60 by 30 program, we had the Dallas Promise program initiative in the Senate Higher Education Committee yesterday with Dr. May and Dr. Lusk presenting and President Mong. And I think that is, if anyone hasn't seen that presentation, it is powerful in how we are addressing the very challenges that you mentioned. And I think with great success. Chairman Turner mentioned retention and graduation rates.
Yep.
And those that have had the least amount of opportunity in their lives, finding great success through these programs. So if we look at the public school initiatives in Dallas ISD and how the African American community and the lower socioeconomic or disadvantaged communities have advanced even over their Highland Park counterparts in grade school, and some of the initiatives that have been put in place by performance-based pay and recruiting and the faculty that have been put in place, you take those examples and you look at 60 by 30 at the higher education level in a program like Dallas Promise, and you see the Texans are meeting the challenge. And we have programs in place to be able to help these individuals overcome what they've faced so far in leading forward to success.
Chairman Turner, you know, we can't get him out of college unless we get him into college. And I'm a parent of a high school senior this year, and so this is personal for me. It's sensitive for me. God, it is awful to apply to college at the moment. And if you're a kid or you're a parent and you're in that position, it's a hell of a time to be applying to a public university in Texas, because it seems like it is harder than it has been at any point to get your kid into school. Do we have a problem getting into college?
Just in the admissions process?
Well, have we made it too difficult? Is the access question, again, kind of in the same way a flashing red light as the affordability question is, and as the excellence question, some believe is the access question a flashing red light at the moment?
You know, I don't know if it's a flashing red light, but it's an area we need to be looking at closely. I think that when we talk about accessibility, we need to make it accessible to apply and gain admission to college. We need to make it affordable, you know, or financially feasible for a student to attend college, whether that's through a combination of financial aid or other means. But you know, I think that the other thing we've got to focus on in Texas, I think this ties into something when you talk about students applying for college. We are losing, and I haven't seen specific numbers, this is largely anecdotal, but I think we can agree it's substantial. We're losing a lot of our smartest kids to other states. And you know, we have a situation where obviously University of Texas at Austin, highly competitive to get into. Texas A&M University, highly competitive to get into. And so sometimes if a student applies and doesn't get accepted to those universities, then the next option is, okay, maybe I'll go to the University of Arkansas. Maybe I'll go to the University of Oklahoma, which are doing a very aggressive job of trying to recruit.
You're really trying
students.
to hurt all of us in this room, aren't you, by mentioning Oklahoma and Arkansas specifically?
Well,
no
you know, it pains me to do it. It pains me to do it, but we have to confront reality on this. That it's not just those schools. You know, it's a lot of schools across the country. But we need to make it so, you know, if someone doesn't get into UT Austin, or at least not as a freshman, or Texas A&M, you know, but there's a bunch of other great universities in the state of Texas.
Within those systems.
Absolutely. Right. There's UT San Antonio, there's UT Arlington, there's UT Dallas, there is University of Houston, different system, great school.
And itself has other schools, not just the main campus. But, I mean, this Chairman Creighton, again, was another Senate Higher Education Committee interim charge, was to talk about how we can strengthen the regional campuses of the systems to ensure that they provide opportunity in cases that people can't attend the flagships.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, you have the system in different university campuses, you have UT Arlington, for instance, or UT San Antonio, who have made great presentations on how their CAP program works and how you can ascend, you know, if you want to transfer into the flagship school. But
and in fact, these may not be second choices or consolation prizes in some cases. UT Arlington, just to pick one school that you mentioned, is a really great school and has had extraordinary success in student success.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I mean, a lot of our students that start out at one of those campuses, and if they originally want to transfer, they have such an amazing experience there that they stay.
They stay
for obvious reasons. And I could mention so many different accomplishments and advances that the two I mentioned, as well as so many others, have to offer. But it just depends on the path that student wants to take, and where are the barriers, and to the goals that they have set for themselves, and how can we accommodate opportunity.
Chair,
let me add to that. I completely agree. And when we talk about the difficulties of just applying to and getting admission, that is true in some cases, but there's also some really innovative things happening to make it easier, particularly for first-generation college students. And I'll brag on UT Arlington a little bit, along with Tarrant County College, our community college in Tarrant County. They, together with Arlington Independent School District, the Mansfield Independent School Districts, and some other districts, have created some really seamless, innovative pathways. So you can go to a high school student living in Arlington, Texas, and say, here's a way that you can basically graduate graduate high school with an associate's degree or close to an associate's degree, and then automatically go into University of Texas at Arlington, and you'll be able to graduate with a bachelor's degree if you stay on a path, at a very reasonable price within a relatively short amount of time. And there are, and I've heard so many anecdotal stories about just students in my district who say, I never thought I could go to college. I mean, that's never been an option for me. And now these doors of opportunity are opening because UT Arlington, TCC, and the school districts are doing some really innovative things, thinking outside the box. And there are other institutions around the state doing something similar. So, and Dallas is a great example too, the community college and the school district.
Chair Creighton, one of the conversations that almost always comes up at the time we talk about access to public universities in Texas is the automatic admit rule. Top 10%, although obviously from the standpoint of UT, it's not top 10% any longer, hasn't been for some time. Chairman Betancourt has introduced legislation this session to get rid of UT and A&M's automatic admit stuff. I believe you have had your name on legislation in the past to do the same. Sure. Are you for getting rid of top 10%, top 6%, 7%? Are you for getting rid of that whole mechanism that's in place now?
Yeah, I think the conversation is important, right? I mean, we always have these barriers to admittance, and we're talking about a lot of talent and versus a lot of need and preferences through our student population for exactly how they fight to go to the university they want to attend.
Right.
But we also have exploding student populations and scarcity as far as how many can be admitted. And
you sound open to the idea,
campuses.
Chairman. I mean, I'm looking for a real cue from you here, and I'm not the only one. You seem open to the idea of overturning this rule.
I was on Chairman Seliger's bill last session that explored the idea of shifting not complete top 10% admittance, but going to a half and half criteria where other metrics for half of the students.
So reducing the number of students who are automatically admitted, not getting rid of it entirely.
Correct.
So you would not be for getting rid of it entirely.
I don't believe that that's where we are today, as far as being realistic. And as I mentioned before, I'm listening closely to the universities and the experts there and what we need to do to have a balanced approach.
Right.
But I was very much for the conversation.
Yeah.
And I think it's important for us to constantly talk about exactly why we have those metrics in place. So the higher education world certainly understands it, but the public back at home and certainly the families in my district understand it.
Well, in fact, I looked up the number of students admitted in your Senate district under the automatic admit thing over the last 10 years. It's almost 2,000 students in your district.
Sure, and
who were beneficiaries of the automatic admit legislation at UT and A&M.
Absolutely. There are so many students that benefit from the current policies. There are so many students that feel disenfranchised from the current policies. So the conversation, it's up to us to constantly explore and validate what our policies are, and as we're here very little time in the scheme of things, a few months every couple of years. There are so many families that constantly want to have us reapproach, reassess, and understand if we need to keep status quo, that we've vetted the issue based on current trends.
Chairman Turner, speaking of current trends, state is getting more diverse. We're 57%, Chairman Turner, people of color in Texas. That trend line is not reversing itself. If you look at the automatic admits over the years that this legislation has been in effect, disproportionately Hispanic, African American, and Asian. Disproportionately, the beneficiaries are from families that have low incomes in households. So the question for those who support this legislation is, if you got rid of it or if you tweaked it, would you go back to a time when college admissions favored those who were wealthier and had more opportunity without needing to be helped, as opposed to the intent of the legislation, I guess, originally, which was to create a more diverse student population at a time when we're trying to leverage opportunity?
I think first off, it never hurts to have the conversation, and so if members bring bills, we should talk about them. But that was the intent. Of course, when Top 10% was passed 20 plus years ago, that was in response to the Supreme Court decision in the Hopwood case that overturned UT's affirmative action policy. And since then, a more limited affirmative action policy has been upheld by the Supreme Court. So the circumstances today for UT and some other schools is a little different than when the top 10% law was passed. That's certainly true. But it is undeniable that in the last 20 years or so, the Hispanic Hispanic enrollment at the University of Texas has dramatically
in particular
has
right,
dramatically increased.
Right.
That's I think if you just glanced at a chart, that would be the thing that jumps off the page to you.
Yeah.
That's a good thing. And so that said, I think that we have to continue to look at these things, as the senator said. When UT, and I'm just using UT as an example right now because I think it affects them the most at the moment, but when UT has basically 25% of their incoming class that they have discretion over the admissions, that's something we need to look at. Is that a good policy? But how do we, if we were to consider any kind of change, how do we do it to where we are not making any, we're not stepping back at all on diversity, and not in any way closing doors to, as you say, people who have gained admission who may not have otherwise.
Right. I mean, that's really before we go to questions of the audience, that's really the challenge, Chair. The population of the state is becoming ever more diverse, and the question is, if you looked out 20 years into the future and you were going to reverse engineer a higher education system built specifically for that future population, is this the way you would do it? And so many of these laws that we're talking about are things that are intended to get us to a place where we have the right higher ed system for the population of the future, but it's harder than it looks, is it not?
That's the feedback I'm getting from the university officials, is that they're doing their best, with every admissions class and all applicants to be fair, and to also help those traditional populations that have not achieved admittance to continue to have the best opportunities they can within those new classes entering the university level. And the conversation that we had in the Senate last session, it didn't dramatically change the metrics on that, but it did reassess exactly why we are where we are today. And there's many new faces in the legislature. There are many new members on each of these committees.
20% of the House is new. I mean, that's right.
Just
brand new. So you'll have the conversation about top 10%, just to close the loop on this. You will have the conversation, but you're not entirely certain where it will land. Will you have the conversation in your committee?
If a bill gets sent to the committee, we'll look at it.
But you're not eager to overturn this or tweak this rule?
No. And I think that, that's such a huge topic. It would require, in my view, a very lengthy discussion, deliberations that I have not been.
Let's take some questions from the audience before we go. We have some hands in the back. Gentlemen, let's do one there and then we'll come up to the front. Mr. Hammond.
Thank you. I thought it was supposed to be 30 minutes of Evan and 30 minutes of audience, but that's for another day.
There's never been 30 minutes of not Evan in history.
Okay, so as you pointed out, only 10% of kids born in poverty achieve anything beyond high school. Yet there are 60% of our student population. 80% of the students who are full-time at Tarrant Community College do not get a degree in 3 years. More than half of the universities have a graduation rate of less than 50%. So first thing, why don't we reinvigorate the funding for outcomes, both for the community colleges and finally begin it for the four-year schools? The results are not good for the future. We need to, lead them to the promised land and get them to do what's right, which they can if they're given the proper incentives.
Chairman Turner, do you dispute Mr. Hammond's premise, and do you agree with his conclusion?
Well, I think that, on the 80% related to Tarrant County College, I haven't seen that particular statistic. I'd say, a lot of our Tarrant County College students go on to a four-year school, so they would not have necessarily graduated with an associate's degree within 3 years because they're working on a bachelor's degree. But certainly there are a number of students, whether at TCC or a lot of other schools, they go to school for a while, maybe they stop and they go to take a full-time job. And that is one of the challenges we have in high, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. For a lot of Texans, life gets in the way. And you gotta have a system where someone's gone to school for a year, maybe they started a family, maybe they got a job opportunity and they stopped going to school, but then they want to come back 5 years later or 10 years later and complete that degree. How do we recapture them and get them back in the system?
Right.
And so I think, that's my concern about some of those statistics. I think on graduation rates, that is an important metric. we should look at. But we should also look at degrees awarded, because sometimes the graduation rates don't reflect accurately for transfers.
Well, you know, Chair Creighton, when we're kind of contemporaries in age, right? When we went to school, the standard was 4 years. You kind of thought 4 years and out, right? Today, it's more like a 6-year default, as we see measures. And honestly, 6 years for some kids may not be enough. To the chairman's point, what President Natalicio at UTEP always talks about, the local train and the express train. Some schools have the luxury of having students who go through higher ed on the express train, but some, she's talking about her student population in El Paso, for instance, they have families, they work jobs, they may be at Fort Bliss taking classes when they can. And it may take them 10 years to get out. Her point is, reward the destination, not the journey, right? There's an express train and there's a local train, and we need to be thinking about getting them out however long it takes, and that is a measure of success. Are you sympathetic to that idea?
I am. I mean, I think the point that Chairman Turner makes is a very valid one. I understand, why Bill is asking the question, for sure. I mean, we're in our working groups right now discussing within the budget, exactly how we may commit to outcome-based funding, and even the data from UT San Antonio and other universities showing that some of these programs have really had significant positives in the short time.
Well, the 6-year numbers have definitely improved over the last few years, but it's just, I think Hammond's question, I'm going to just distill it, is it enough?
But for me personally, I mean, and we have a lot of conversations about, college isn't for everyone, and you may either go this direction to develop a skill or a trade, or this direction to go to college. For me, it was both, and I had to step in and out of my college experience over a span of time as I developed a skill and a trade and got a job to support myself.
How long did it take you to get out of UT Austin?
It took almost 6.
Right.
And then I worked for the Attorney General for a couple of years and then went to law school. But I had to find a night school next door to a Capitol building, because I thought at a Capitol building I'd have a shot at getting a job, and with a night school I'd have a shot at surviving. And so I drove 404 miles to Oklahoma City for that reason. And so I always knew as a pipe fitter that I could go to work at any chemical plant if I lost my job at the Capitol. But my goal was always through the community
Most people who work at the Capitol are perfectly qualified to be pipe fitters.
You know,
in my experience.
One thing about our staff at the Capitol and our interns and our student population and those that are helping us in our offices, it's amazing how powerful their stories are.
Yeah.
And that was exactly mine when Bill Hobby was leaving as lieutenant governor and Bob Bullock was coming in and Governor Richards was coming in. I was here, working my way through school and couldn't have made it without it.
Right.
So,
gentleman in the front.
Yeah.
Sir.
Yes, we focus so much on graduation rates and preparing students for the workforce, but it seems like we don't really do anything to prepare them to actually be citizens. And considering Texas is one of the worst by any number of measures as far as civic participation, civic engagement, what is it that we can do in higher ed to actually prepare students to be like good people and be people who are actually productive as far as their community, as opposed to just people who work?
Right. Chairman Creighton, that's actually, again, I'll ask if you agree with the premise, but there is this question of whether, in addition to creating the future workforce, we're creating the future citizenry of Texas. We're all going to get old and hand the baton to the next generation. Are they prepared to be the best citizens that they can be through higher ed?
You know, it's a great question, and it's right on point. I mean, many of us believe that starts out at home, and the responsibilities for family and the direction and examples that are given and upbringing, that it's a lot in how you're raised as to the moral direction you take and your work ethic and everything else. But there are so many mentor programs and so many developing programs at the higher education level that are there for students that will seek them out. But we have to keep the conversation going, and it's up to us to lead on it and to make sure that we're out front in our communities while we're in session, and also when we leave, to talk about what those needs are and how we address them. But again, the expertise that we have, and one thing I've learned in the short time that I've been chair of this committee is how talented those that individuals are that lead our universities and that work in this space.
Right.
And what they offer to the incoming student populations. we're turning a corner with some great examples of what we can do with the very subject you bring up. We've got a long way to go.
Chairman Turner, the fact is that in the last election, as much as in the previous number of elections, the college student population was not engaged in a larger conversation about the world. Boy, they were engaged this last time, weren't they?
They were, and that's a good thing, and I think they'll be engaged in
Well, you liked it especially because it was good for your side this last time, right?
Well, it was
Might
good.
not be good the next time, but it was good this time.
It was good, but
Yeah.
even if it went the other way, it would be good
Yeah.
to have younger people engaged. And there's actually a great legislative proposal, I think, that would help address this issue. Representative Gina Hinojosa has a bill to say that for any college or university campus that has an enrollment of 10,000 students or more, that there needs to be an early vote location placed on that campus.
I'm sure that will pass without any controversy at all.
It's a discussion we need to have, because a lot of, at any of these campuses, especially students living on campus, they don't have a car necessarily. They're on campus or right around campus all the time.
Right.
We don't need to make it hard for people to vote.
I'm certain that what we need more of in the world is what happened at Texas State this last election cycle. I'm sure that's exactly what you'll see. No controversy whatsoever. Secretary Fainter, and then we'll go to this gentleman here and we'll wrap.
One of the things that I've noticed in my, I guess, avocation toward education, and particularly higher education, is that there appears to be historically a gap between public education and higher education in the coordination of programs, training, and background. And I read daily about a school district a public school district that's in terrible shape. Won't mention any by name, but y'all all know some of them. And it seems to be that has to be coordinated with higher education so that these public schools, the K through 12, are prepared for the higher education. We read also daily that in a very short period of time, there are not going to be any jobs for anybody who doesn't have post-secondary education.
Yep.
And I use the expression, you can't make a living with your back anymore like you used to when I got out of school. And are you coordinating with the respective public education schools, committees in both of the houses? Or should that, and I recognize there's such a focus on public education this session, but that's certainly a long-term trend.
So let's make this a short answer to Mr. Fainter's question, as it's 9 o'clock actually. I'm afraid we'll have to make this the last one, but what kind of coordination do we want to see between the education schools and higher ed generally and this issue he's raising?
At the local level, again, I bring up, because it's current from our hearing yesterday, that again, the Dallas Promise program is how Dr. May and Dr. Lush from the public school level to the higher education level are communicating and not working in silos. It was as impressive of a program and a plan that I've heard. At the state level, Senator Larry Taylor, Chairman of Public Education, has a seat on the Senate Higher Education Committee. And as we work together in merging the policies and the goals going forward, we're also very tied into Senate finance members like Senator Betancourt and others that serve on higher ed. So we're working to merge all of those goals together to make sure that we don't have the gaps in the future that you mentioned.
And in your case, Chair Turner, your appropriations chair is a former higher ed chair, right?
Well, absolutely.
He understands these issues in the House.
He understands as well as or better than anybody.
Right.
But I do agree with the premise of the question. And I think a couple things. Yeah, I think we got to work better in the legislature to see that we're better coordinating, and that's something Chairman Huberty and Chairman Zerwas and I and other members are going to continue talking about. But at the local level, I think the Dallas Promise program, great example of where the situation is changing in a positive way. The programs I mentioned in Tarrant County with UT Arlington and school districts are changing. That's helping. We need more of those kinds of partnerships. We need to drill down on dual credit, early college, high schools, AP, and other things like that to help that transition and create that pathway.
I'm sorry for being 2 minutes late and ending, but I can't resist Mr. Fainter. Out of respect for the former Secretary of State. Thank you all so much for coming. Give our chairs a big hand. We'll see you again soon. Have a good day.
Thank you,
Chairman.
Evan. Always good.
Good to be with you. Thank you so much.
Appreciate you.